Welcome to class 2 of Buddhism in a nutshell. It is a 5-week course, so we have 3 more weeks after tonight. And we're going to begin by starting in a slightly different direction than we ended last week's class. We ended last week's class with a bit of an introduction to the Four Noble Truths, and we're going to circle back to that, but we're going to kind of zoom out at the very beginning of today's class and begin to talk about the Buddhist model of the mind, because ultimately everything in Buddhism is about training the mind, and that depends upon working cooperatively with the mind's nature and the nature of reality, the kind of the fundamental, and then I would say also the deep interconnection between those two things that Buddhism asserts is true. So there are certain, things that you have to work cooperatively with. You can't change their fundamental nature. You can understand their fundamental nature and use that understanding to achieve the intended result or the desired result. And that's really what, the Buddha was able to do by deeply understanding the mind, how it works, and then what is the existential condition that we all find ourselves in. So we're going to then start by, as I said, talking about the Buddhist model of the mind. So, as I said, everything that the Buddha taught is focused on the development of the mind. We talked a little bit about the mind's nature, the formless nature of the mind last time, and how it enables enlightenment, because, as it says here, you know, um, the mind at its base is simply clarity and awareness, that which is a formless, non-physical energy that is separate from the body, has a different, unique continuum from the body. The body begins in the womb, but the mind does not. The mind preceded the coming together of the body in the womb, and it will survive the dissolution of this physical form at death. But these two qualities of clarity and awareness, we might think that, and as it says here, as we go through the course, sometimes I might use the word mind, sometimes consciousness, but those are going to mean the same thing: the subjective awareness of a sentient being, a sem chen, a mind possessor, like us, like animals, and like beings of other realms that we don't have access to, that we can't see, that the Buddha was able to see once he achieved enlightenment and was able to discern that mind also associates with forms in other realms other than just human and animal. And we may have touched on the fact that, of course, biologically, in our Western way of talking, humans are animals, in the sense that they're not plants, they're not fungi, but Buddhism does make a distinction between humans and animals in terms of the subjective experience, kind of the possible realm of subjective experience that's open to them, mainly due to the way that consciousness is expressed through those different forms. The animal form is just much more limited in its intelligence. And so, therefore, the subjective experience of an animal is one of mental dullness and one of instinct, one of fear. Um, and the human experience can, of course, there are people whose bodies, whose minds are badly damaged, or become badly damaged, or born that way, and they don't necessarily have the more expanded options that are open But broadly speaking, the mind of a human has the intelligence of a human, which is just normal, average intelligence. But that means that spiritual growth is possible for that person because they have the attention, the capacity to direct their mind in an intentionally spiritual direction. Of course, animals show compassion, they show loving kindness, they show care, but they're not sitting there thinking about how can I expand that to encompass all sentient beings. They might act that way with the sentient beings that they're interacting with, but humans can analyze in a way that's just not open to animals. And for those reasons, Buddhism does make a distinction and does present the human realm as being above that of the animal realm because they are very, very different conceptual, subjective experiences that these sentient beings are able to have. But even for an animal, the fundamental nature of their mind still is clarity and awareness, just like it is for us. And um, clarity just means a formless, non-physical energy, and awareness means able to develop some sort of internal representation of that which the mind is directed toward. So when we see something, when we think about something, when we touch something, when we smell something, when we hear something, one of our consciousnesses, our sense consciousnesses, is being directed towards something outside of ourselves and is developing an internal representation of that thing. Or if it's simply the mental sense, then we're remembering, we are imagining, we're planning, we're creating, again, an internal representation of something in the mind. So what this now is getting at is when we hear clarity and awareness, we might think that the Buddha is saying that our minds are, you know, completely accurate, that our minds are seeing everything as they are, no problems, everything is just pristine, and so on. And unfortunately, that is the fundamental, most essential nature of consciousness. Unfortunately, as we mentioned in the first class, as an ordinary sentient being, our mind is arising with the afflictions, with the obscurations, the delusions, all different words, for the same thing. So you can think of those as, clouds that are covering the sun, or veils that are, covering a jewel, what have you. This fundamental nature of the mind isn't something that we truly are able to experience because we tend to experience much coarser levels of the mind, and those much coarser levels of the mind are deeply influenced, are deeply stained by these these afflictions, these delusions, these obscurations, because they arise with ordinary mind. But they are not, because the mind's fundamental nature is simply clarity and awareness, although the delusions are co-arising with ordinary mind, they are two separate things, just like the clouds and the sun and the veil and the jewel. They are two separate, different phenomenon. One is simply interacting with the other in a way that is problematic, in a way that for us is preventing us from really being in tune with that fundamental nature. But it is possible, these obscurations, these delusions, because they are separate from the mind's most essential nature, through training, through practice, through meditation, through study, eventually we are able to uproot all of the afflicted states. And then mind can simply abide as mind. And that is enlightened mind. There is nothing different about our mind. The mind that we have, its fundamental nature, when it is free from affliction, when it is free from obscuration, it functions as enlightened mind. It functions as the mind of a Buddha. It's just being prevented from doing that up until the point when we choose, if we want to do the work that frees the mind from the obscurations. Um, as we said in the first class, we're just part of nature, and our minds are part of nature, and enlightenment is something that nature permits when certain realizations are accomplished, certain capacities are cultivated and developed, and then mind can abide as mind, completely removed from all of these obscurations, all of these mental afflictions or kleshas in Sanskrit. Okay. So when we talk about mind or we talk about consciousness, we are really talking about six different minds or six different consciousnesses, because these are all ways of knowing. These are all ways of interacting with our environment and developing knowledge about what's around us. So we have the five bodily consciousnesses, and then we have the mental sense consciousness. And oftentimes, and this is quite technical in a way, but Buddhism is very precise. Buddhism is a very precise cognitive psychology in a way. And so precision really is important to really understand, because again, when we go back to the Four Noble Truths, we have to understand, yes, we're in a difficult situation, but there is a reason for that. That reason, the cause can be uprooted, and that there is a reliable and repeatable way of engaging in a process that leads to that uprooting of that problem. So really being precise and diagnosing exactly what is happening and why it's happening and how it's happening is something that Buddhism has spent hundreds, thousands of years really honing and refining. So we just think of the mind as the mind, but really we're talking about six different minds. We've got the five bodily senses and then the mental sense consciousness. Um, so generally speaking, for us, we are hearing or tasting or touching or seeing, we're engaging with the bodily sense consciousnesses, and data is coming in of what this sounds like, what this tastes like, what this looks like, what this feels like, and then the mental sense consciousness. And this is why precision is so important, is because these two systems are working in tandem. But when we don't really think about it, it all looks like it's one thing. And when it looks like it's all one thing, we misunderstand that reinforces our misunderstanding of what's actually happening. So when we hear something, when we hear music, let's say, then could be jazz music, could be country music, um, we are going to very, very quickly decide, do I want to continue to listen to this? Do I want to change the station? If it's coming from next door and I can't change the station, am I cool with that? Am I like grooving along to that? Or is it really bothering me? Am I like admiring their taste in music? Or am I really debating whether or not I get up and go outside and knock on their door and ask them to turn it down? Um, and the problem is that all of those judgments about the sensory data are happening in the mental sense consciousness, which is co-arising or happening in tandem with the sensory data of just these frequencies that are hitting our eardrums and being translated into neurochemical signaling, which is being processed by the brain and experienced in a particular way. All of that's happening, but the judgment of I like this, I don't like this, I want more of this, I need to have less of this, I don't want this right now, maybe later. Um, that is happening in the mental sense consciousness. But when we aren't precise, when we don't analyze our experience, what happens is we believe that our view of this is pleasant, this is unpleasant, is coming from the object itself. We believe that is a pleasant object or that is an unpleasant object. We think that there's something about the object that is pleasant or is unpleasant, when in fact, our perception of pleasant and unpleasant is simply a judgment that's happening in the mental sense consciousness, which is interpreting sensory data from one of the five bodily sense consciousnesses. Um, so, and that, that is really what drives a lot of our problems, right? We feel like on the basis of this misunderstanding, we feel like in order for me to be happy, the purpose of my life is to collect as many pleasant things in my environment as I possibly can, and to be separated for as much of my life, as much of my day, as much of my week, and as much as my life as I can from the things that seem unpleasant, that seem painful, because we think pleasure and pain are present in the objects themselves. So, yeah, so we go through life then pushing and pulling things into our experience, collecting the pleasant, moving away from the unpleasant, and we feel like that's our only choice. We don't recognize that we can be equanimous, we can have an even temper irrespective of whether we're in contact with what's pleasant. We're able to get what we want or we're prevented from getting what we want. The mind is capable of being equanimous in those situations and, having a deeper, more introspective understanding of what is happening. But that takes a lot of time and energy and effort. And I think we went through it a little bit, last week. When we were growing up, we didn't have any of these tools, right? We cried and we were fed. We reached for the toy and we were soothed. We reached for a parent and they responded with, touch and care. And so we navigated our whole environment for years and years and years by pushing and pulling. And that's a habit that has stuck. And Buddhism would suggest that we've been practicing that habit, not just for this life, but it's deeply ingrained over beginningless past lives. Um, so that's, a really important, so really unpacking exactly how the mind works and exactly what's going on is how you can begin to unravel these knots of reactivity that we find ourselves in that are causing a lot of our stress, a lot of our problems, a lot of the difficulties that we face. Okay, so let me pause here. Um, I didn't ask if there were any questions about prior material before moving on. So if there are, we can address those. But has anything I said sparked a thought or a question or a disagreement, a concern?
Yeah, I guess I'll ask something.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, in terms of okay, so I've read some things where it says the gut has something to do with the brain. It's like a science thing, it's connected. So I guess my question was, in terms of us experiencing mind, does our physical health, gut including the brain, have any influences over the mind?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we of course we are embodied, presently we are experiencing an embodied existence, right? There's in Buddhism they talk about the intermediate, state in between lifetimes where mind separates from body before mind takes another form. But there's still a subtle, you know, and more energetic body and so on in that state. But of course, if we do have a brain, and the brain and the mind are deeply interconnected. We know that we can take substances, we can take different psychogenic substances, whether that's a side effect of a pain medication or whether it's a recreational substance. Certainly we can ingest those, and our subjective experience changes drastically in those experiences. And of course, more subtly, if we eat really poor, if really, really poor diet, and we're not giving our body the nutrients that it needs to perform optimally, then it's not going to secrete the right kinds of neurotransmitters, and the things are going to get gummed up and not work as well. And there's certainly links between fruit and vegetable intake and depression and all kinds of things. Um, so, as embodied beings, our environmental influences, and our internal, and even as you said, the gut microbiome, is a rich field of study for what are those microbes secreting in our gut, and what is being absorbed by the gut lining, by those what they're pumping out and flooding our body with. Um, all of that is playing a role, but it's playing a role in the brain, which is then in turn influencing our subjective awareness, which is certainly just like if we took alcohol or what have you. It's not the mind itself is a non-physical entity, a non-physical phenomenon, but it's having an embodied connection at the moment. So,
But the thing is, yeah, I get that, right? When you're intoxicated. But does the influ because awareness doesn't have to be connected to the body as it is aware of the body. That connection is made um, consciously. Well, it's to the point where almost because I'm unconscious because it's done like right then and there, immediately, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is because I've experienced problems where my brain has been completely messed up. But when I went into the awareness actually to me was something that never changes. You know what I
mm,
mean? It has no influence on whether your leg is broken or your brain is retarded. To me, it just stood still. But then again, I was in that state where I was able to detach or see through the body as well, that
mhm.
just the body. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I mean, because the mind is a non-physical energy that is separate from the body,
Right.
there are these deeper levels of the mind that we can learn to access through meditation, through different practices. And certainly there are many people who report, being able to use deep sleep, in a spiritual way that isn't open to an ordinary person, even like a coma, being able to maintain some,
Mm,
because, the thread of consciousness, um, it is influenced by the body, but it isn't dependent on the body. It doesn't
right.
require the body. Um, but that, that does, if a person is like deeply depressed, it's hard to say, well, your mind, just snap out of it, or, because some people, they do benefit from medication for a while. Um, it is something that does have to be intentionally cultivated. Um,
Right.
Certainly
Right.
some people are going to benefit from certain medicational interventions for a time. And then, maybe that gives them the space to to go deeper and to do something that doesn't, require that. That could also be true. Um, but yeah, I
Yes.
mean, because they are separate phenomenon, they can be, the mind can be accessed without requiring the body. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mary Jo, you had a question or a thought? You're still muted.
Um, I think it's more of a thought, maybe. I have a friend right now who is, she's been plagued by really anger, and she speaks of it, and um, she's also very kind of a fiery personality person, and she does take psychotropic medicines. I I think for like bipolar, I think, although I haven't asked her specifically, but so she's now just she's gotten very interested in Ayurvedic treatment of, there are three body types, and Pitta is one of those, very fiery and quick to do things and so forth. I don't remember what the other two are, but she's so there were a large variety of changes which it's thought will diminish this pitta energy which she has. And excuse me, I'm going to sneeze, I think. Excuse me. um, it all seems good to me, and but of course I feel like deeper levels would be as considered through Buddhism. And but at this point, anyway, I I think it's just beyond her, and so forth. And I am just encouraging her to experiment with this. I think it could be very helpful. Meditation is one of those things thought to be beneficial, and some other things, pranayama, breathing, and so forth. And I like the sound of it. It seems good to me. It's like, what's the downside? I don't see it. So, but I guess my impulse kind of, or my internal wishing is that she could uh, at least stick a big toe into the Buddhist realm and learn. But I think I have to give up on that, and I don't really suggest that to her. she and her friend know that I meditate and that I think it's important, and I think that's as beneficial as my influence, little that it is, can be. Thank you. Thank you. It's a very interesting topic for sure.
Dear, did you have a question or a thought or a disagreement?
Yeah, I just had a quick comment because actually been joining a lot of Buddhism meditations, and they actually been helping me because I've experienced a lot of trauma in my life, um, especially just losing my father in a traumatic way, and then experiencing a lot of anger, as I've experienced a lot of anger as a child, and actually just graduated from being a nutritionist, and we talked about a lot about how the gut and the brain goes together. So it's really interesting just hear relive it. Like it's like reassuring, that I'm kind of taking the right direction.
Thank you. Yeah. Didn't mean to. Okay. Let's see. Okay, right. So the mind. So then, in terms of these six consciousnesses, the way that the mind is working then is, again, so we've said, that the mind is shapeless, formless, not physical, energetic, um, and it um, and so therefore it is not bound by the limitations. We said that, I think, in the first class where, doesn't we try to exercise, we try to eat right, and but we can get to a certain point because of our physical body, but then aging is going to take a toll, and eventually we will become more and more frail and so on. Regardless of what we do, we should still exercise and eat right, but the body is following the laws of physics and is constrained in a way that the mind is not. Um, and so what the mind is doing is it's going out and it's contacting these objects, the objects that are unique. So the eye sense consciousness is contacting just shape and color. The ear sense consciousness is contacting sound. The gustatory sense, the tongue sense consciousness is cognizing, bitter, sour, sweet, etc. And then, so it has its own unique object of awareness. And then it depends upon this previous moment in the continuity. So all of these consciousnesses are continuities, right? We are constantly, as long as we're alive in this body, we're seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and so on. But of course, we could lose one of our senses. We could become blind. We could become deaf. Um, and then that continuity would cease, that particular continuity. So it does depend upon being able to develop an internal representation of an object of awareness does require a continuity of that consciousness. Um, but fundamentally here, what this is helping us to understand is that this is something that these are not fixed, immutable processes, that these are transformable. The mind is changeable because it's not limited to the body. It doesn't require the body. It didn't come from the body. It's just connected to the body. It's influenced, and that influence goes. We talked in the first class about how when you spend time choosing to meditate on loving kindness for 6 months, they can demonstrate changes in the physical brain that result from that. So this, it goes both ways. The body influences the mind, and the mind influences the body. But the mind itself as a non-physical energy is limitless in its capacity. The body is limited in its capacity. We will reach peak physical conditioning and then we will decline. But the mind can be trained, can be transformed without that limit. So what the mind is really composed of, what they say, is moments of mind. And we talked, I think, a little bit about this in the first class. The idea is that the mind, we perceive the mind to be like this uninterrupted movie, but really the mind is a series of discrete mental events, mental moments that are just, as it says here, there's 65, I assume great meditators of the past were able to develop such a high degree of internal understanding of the functioning of their mind that they could actually observe 65 discrete movements of mind in each finger snap, right? So like what, 1/10 of a second or something, 1/50th of a second. In each of those very brief moments, there's 65 discrete mental events happening, and we're only aware of one at best, right? But if you think about it, even just now, all of our senses are being engaged simultaneously. Our sight, our sound, our, physical presence in the chair. We might be tasting, our mouth has some taste on its own. We're smelling, whatever's happening in the air. And we're just sort of discarding most of that in order to attend to a very narrow range. But still, all of that sensory data is bombarding the mind, in every moment. So the mind is this beginningless and endless continuity of these discrete mental events. And we did, I think we said in the first class that the Buddha wasn't able to find the beginning point of this continuity. It is a beginningless and endless continuity of discrete mental events that are just happening so rapidly that we experience them as seamless, as one, uniform. Just like if you were to slow the movie down, you could find each frame and you could go frame by frame. These great meditators can find these 65 different movements in each finger snap, which we're just not able to do. But it's happening. Even though we can't perceive it, it's just below the level of our conscious awareness. So then the implication of that from the Buddhist perspective, this is the foundation of the Buddhist teaching on rebirth or reincarnation. If the mind is this non-physical energy that it has no beginning and no end, and we are sentient beings that are experiencing mind, then this mind and became associated with this physical form, and that association will last until our physical body is no longer able to support this consciousness, and then body and mind separate, and we call that death, when body and mind are irrevocably split, separated in a way where they can never be rejoined again, which can happen just due to aging, can happen due to injury, all kinds of things can be the cause of our death. But that is the foundation for the Buddhist teaching on rebirth, that the mind, the cause of our mind isn't our physical body, and so it is just a previous moment of mind. This moment of mind's principal cause is the previous moment in the continuity of consciousness. And that continuity isn't breakable, and it has no beginning and no end. So mind is simply one unbroken continuity that is experiencing a myriad of different individual lifetimes that are all of these different experiences, all of these different um, appearances that are occurring in each of these individual lifetimes. But the continuity of mind is the thread that is connecting all of these experiences, all of these different appearances to mind. Okay, so that is a brief understanding or brief overview of the Buddhist model of mind. Any thoughts or questions on that topic? All right, so go into a different direction, and we'll touch briefly on this idea in Buddhism of, yes, Mary Jo, did you have?
On the
Sorry,
slow on the technology and such.
no problem.
Um, so these brief experiences, um, I suppose they have a time frame of their own. I mean, some of them could be further apart and some of them could be closer together. Is that what you understand?
Could you say more about what you mean? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what your question is.
Well, these moments of consciousness that are being, um, I think, experienced through the mind, that they, some of them could be very fast moving, I'm thinking, and some of them maybe slow moving. Is that what you think?
Well, so certainly, I mean, we can either through choice or through habit, we revisit certain things, over and over again, right? We ruminate on like, oh, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe this person did this. We strengthen certain ways of relating to others or taking in information, and other times, and those are often things um, that we feel threatened by, the ego feels threatened by, or and we give them great weight, and we spend a lot of time reinforcing that. And then other things are just kind of meaningless, like, oh, I saw a fly in the hallway, as I was going to my car. Like we'll never think about that again, right? It just, we observed it,
Yeah,
and um, so certainly, I would say that the mind has different habits and different tendencies, and where we are biased there's certain unconscious biases that we have, certain biases that we've strengthened over the course of our lifetime, um, and they give information that's coming in different weight, and that weight has an influence of um, how important it seems and how often we revisit things, and that's certainly all true. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
All right. So, just to give a little brief teaching or discussion on themes that you find in Buddhism that are very important, and this will come back when we talk about karma in more detail. Um, but motivation and dedication, I mean, and particularly motivation, I think is of the two, dedication um, comes into play in very formal Buddhist practice, but motivation is omnipresent, right? Why am I doing something? Um, and so, the reason, most of the time, the reason why we're doing something is because it makes us more comfortable, we enjoy it, it's pleasurable, or it's helping us avoid something that we dislike, that we want to be separated from. But the more that we can think about wanting to do something because it's useful for others, that's the fundamental, really virtuous motivation. That the more that we can cultivate that motivation throughout our lives, the faster we will be able to move in a spiritual direction. Um, the more our motivations are simply to feel better, to be more at ease personally, that's kind of a stagnant, a stagnating motivation. It's not really helping us to move in a more spiritual direction where we're really thinking about others and we are trying to do something that is useful, even if what we're doing is very mundane, like, we sell clothes to somebody, or somebody asks us the direction, somebody stops us on the street and asks us, where is this? How do I get to this place? If we really wish, if we can pause and really wish to do whatever is most helpful in that moment to be of benefit to them, the more times in our day when we can do that, that is what is most powerfully supportive of our spiritual path. Um, and then, of course, when we engage in virtue specifically, um, and particularly this is, more formal practice, like after a session of meditation, when we engage in something virtuous, after we've done it, before we do it, we motivate, right? We think, I'm about to do something. Why am I about to do something? How do I make my reason for doing it inclusive of others? Then we do whatever it is, and then it's been done, right? We have this, we have this action that we've done, and then we can think, may this action, may whatever benefit may that be, may that plant the seed of kindness in their mind that brings them to enlightenment, right? That's very grandiose, right? But the more grandiose we can think, of course, we don't say this out loud, or like, it's just a mental internal thing where we've done something and then we dedicate for, we offer that. We think, because but on the basis of my having done this, may the results of that have these vast, incredible, beneficial knock-on effects. So there's the motivation, the action, and the dedication. Um, and of course, we can integrate that, integrate all of this in our daily life. Yes, Jay.
Um, yeah, so I guess I just had a question with the organizational part in terms of this structure. I mean, I understand, you know, what this is trying to do, with setting our intention and cultivating that aspect. But, um, like for me personally, I've, uh, in terms of like insights, when you have those insights into the nature of reality, and when you become in direct experience, knowing um, that you that you're that the people you're interacting with are essentially you, right? Now, I'm assuming this is cultivating or a condition or a state for to prime yourself to see that, or does that happen prior? I just want to know
Mhm.
is happening to make sure, because I'm assuming only the combination of that will make this a deeper practice rather than a surface level, hey, I'm doing something good for you. You know what I mean? So just help me put this whole picture together.
Hmm. So, I mean, essentially, so ultimately, Buddhism has two different bodies of knowledge that are combined. They call it the wisdom wing and the compassion wing, right? So the wisdom wing is, all of the teachings on the nature of reality. And, so it's true that ultimately, sentient beings are empty of inherent existence, and so am I, and and things are, illusion-like, and all of this. But that by itself, that can lead a person to just think, well, so nothing really matters. It's all, nothing, I don't need to also wish for other people's well-being because, ultimately their suffering is just based on delusion. It's not real. It's not tangible. Um, so we have to combine, a lot of care for others with simultaneous with understanding their ultimate nature. So we can't only do one and not do the other. We do both, and we just haven't really gotten to. I would say that um, in order to really have this direct insight, the mind, we have to, as you said, prime the mind. We have to clear away um, enough of the afflictions. We have to calm them down to the point where that object can arise in the mind. And for us, the drive to look after just ourselves, the drive to um, just make things work out for our own interests is so strong that that is very disturbing. That's very agitating to the mind when the mind is constantly up and down, depending on, did this person smile at me? Was there traffic? Did they say a kind thing, or did they mean to close the door in my face? Our minds are so unstable from all of these, the way that we're interpreting the world through the egoistic self preoccupation, that is just the default state for all of us, that the more that we can train the mind to focus on loving kindness, focus on compassion, focus on care for others, that naturally subdues, it doesn't completely eliminate, but it calms the afflictions down, it subdues the afflictions, and it makes the mind more clear, more peaceful, more at ease, less reactive, less interested in making things work out, less needing to push and pull everything that's in our experience. And then the deeper states of wisdom are able to grow more fertily in that mind. Um, and so we can't just, I mean, there are reasons why the Buddha didn't only teach the wisdom teachings, where he taught the wisdom teachings and the compassion teachings. And there's also, Buddhism would say that ultimately um, the reason that the enlightened state takes the form that it takes is due to the the force of training the mind in this direction. The fact that the reason that enlightened mind continues to work for the benefit of sentient beings is because of all of the training in wanting to accomplish the welfare of other sentient beings. Um, so they are reinforcing, once you really correctly understand the wisdom teachings, they reinforce the compassion, you know, side of things too, because like you're saying, when you see um, you know, there are no truly separate selves, then it's like, well, why wouldn't I work? It's like if it's all just sort of one organism, right? Well, of course, wouldn't make sense to just work to benefit the fingernail, right? You would work to benefit the whole system simultaneously. Um, but still, it's that those insights, they become easier and deeper to cultivate when you're working on the preoccupation with the ego.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the wisdom teachings are the direct experience, right?
I mean, ultimately, it becomes you start out with a correct conceptual understanding of the nature of reality. And then just through repetition, it does become a direct, non-conceptual realization.
Okay, okay.
Seer.
Hey, okay. I was just going to ask, like, what are some, because there's a lot of distractions in this world, and it can, for me anyway, steer me away from my meditation practices. And then, like how you were saying, the mentals kind of just go up and down, and then it gets, you know, my mind gets flustered. Um, how can we, you know, train the mind to not focus in on the negative distractions, but like you were saying, you learn to teach. I mean, you focus on like kind and love and
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, every meditator has the experience of the mind doing its own thing, right? You know what your goal is for a given session of meditation, but then other thoughts are going to intrude. The only thing that we can do is notice, is decide, so one thing that's helpful is to not try to do too long of a session so that we can stay fresh, so that we can stay concentrated. So we try to just keep our sessions to 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Um, and then we can take a short break and do another one if we still feel good about it. Or we can do another one later in the day, what have you. But that's helpful to not be doing too much too quickly. But really, all that there is the noticing that, okay, this was my intended object. I sat down to do loving kindness meditation, and now I'm thinking about how difficult my boss is, and that's a distraction, right? So we have the intended object of loving kindness. We have the distraction of my boss said this rude thing to me today, and it's really difficult. But then we just say, this is a distraction. I'm going to stop energizing that chain of thought with my attention, and I'm simply going to go back to my intended object. And then if a couple seconds later, another distraction's going to arise, and I'm going to just go back. So the obstacle is in thinking that that's a problem. The obstacle is in labeling the arising of distraction as a problem. The arising of distraction is just how it works. Just like if you were to go to the gym and say it's a problem that these heavy things have to be lifted repetitiously, right? Why am I going here where the heavy things are and picking them up over and over again? That's the process, right? There is no other process for getting stronger other than going to the place where they put the heavy things and lifting them over and over again. And there is no process for training the mind other than the mind is going to go off and do its thing, and you're simply going to notice that that's what happened, and then stop energizing that chain of thinking as soon as it becomes possible to do that. Um, and then you bring the mind back. And eventually, your mind figures out what you're doing. Your mind will naturally follow that process. It will, on its own, begin to settle on your intended object. But it's a lifelong, just like your physical health isn't something you stop caring about or stop doing, right? Your spiritual health, your mental health is also a lifelong pursuit. So it's going to be, the discouragement of labeling the process of engaging in spiritual health, as a problem, that is the obstacle. And we just have to not do that. We just have to think, yes, distractions arise, and my only job is to notice that that happened, and I'll bring my mind back to the object. I get distracted again, and I bring my mind back again. And I'm going to do that in every session, every day, until the end of this life. Just like I can't stop eating healthy food, and I can't stop, exercising my body.
A good quote is, when you don't give power into those thoughts have no power over you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we're going to move now in a new direction, a new direction, and talk about what are called the four seals. And so this topic is how we can distinguish what a genuine Buddhist teaching is, or we can distinguish what a Buddhist practitioner accepts as true. So this is a way of being able, if someone tells us, oh, this is what the Buddha taught, then we can, once we learn what the four seals are, we can say, is this teaching, does it comport with the four seals or not? And if it doesn't, then it isn't something that the Buddha taught, because these are four. Seal here means like royal seal, like a seal on an envelope with wax, with the royal stamp that authenticates what's inside, right? That's the meaning of seal. And so this is what authenticates Buddhist teaching. If it comports with the four seals, then the Buddha taught it. If what the teaching is, if it violates one of the four seals, that doesn't mean it's bad, but it just means it's from a different philosophical system. So the first of the four seals is that all compounded phenomena are impermanent. So everything here, and this is so this slide isn't maybe the best phrasing. All compounded phenomena are impermanent is true, and in almost all cases, what that means is that things tend toward dissolution. Um, our bodies tend toward dissolution. Every physical thing in our world tends toward dissolution. But really, it is also true that impermanent simply means that which changes moment by moment. And so the mind is an impermanent phenomena that doesn't. There are a couple things, there are very few exceptions, there are a couple things that don't tend toward dissolution, and the mind is an impermanent phenomenon that doesn't tend toward dissolution. But in terms of our interactions with our physical world, of course, then what we can say validly is that everything that we can see and taste and touch and hear and smell and so on, it's tending toward dissolution on the basis of its impermanence. But impermanent by itself does only mean that it's changing moment by moment by moment, that it's not that the continuity of that phenomenon isn't the same in any two moments. So if somebody says that some so a compounded phenomena is anything that exists, as it says, if it's made of parts, or if it's the coming together of causes and conditions, then it's a compounded phenomena, then it is impermanent. So if somebody says that something that is composed of parts isn't changing moment by moment, the body, the mind, the physical world, etc. Somebody, if someone asserts, like, and that happens, right? Of course, there are philosophical systems that assert a soul that is unchanging, that is permanent, that doesn't change moment by moment. And that's not a Buddhist teaching. That's a perfectly fine teaching, but it's not a Buddhist teaching. Um, yeah. So then all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. So a contaminated thing, as it says here, is anything that arises from karma and delusion. So our bodies, unfortunately, our bodies, our minds, our physical world on the earth as we experience it as an ordinary sentient being, these are all contaminated, which is a heavy word in English, but it just means ordinary. I just think of it as meaning ordinary. It arose due to past karma and delusion. And because its origin is past karma and delusion, its nature, as we've talked about, its nature is not truly, genuinely satisfying. Um, food and so on. There's no food, there's no music, there's no activity, there's no experience, there's no object that exists in our world that is truly in the nature of deep, real satisfaction. The third seal is something that we're going to come back to um, at the end. It's all phenomenon are selfless. They're empty of inherent independent existence. And we've touched a little bit on that as we've gone along, where we looked at this idea of when we cognize things, we believe that we are cognizing something that is pleasant or unpleasant from its own side, something that is kind of broadcasting some essence to our observing, impartial consciousness. And really, what's true is that our active cognition is much more active than that. But we're going to unpack that in much more detail in the fifth class. We're going to spend most of that class talking about this idea of selflessness, but we need to give it, the time to do that. Then the fourth seal is just called nirvana, is peace. Um, and so the Buddha taught lower nirvana and higher nirvana, the path of training of the Theravadan tradition and the path of training in the Mahayana tradition, and they are both true permanent cessations of suffering. So okay, so those are the four seals. So um, four qualities of a genuine Buddhist teaching, you could say. So if someone says that you have a permanent, unchanging soul, and with this idea of nirvana is peace, some people would say, well, we should just aim for a heavenly state. Buddha would say that there are heavenly states, but as long as you're an ordinary sentient being and you haven't actually ceased all of the mental afflictions, then it's not genuine. You you go to the Christian heaven and you just hang out with your in-laws, right? No, it's not something that sounds particularly amazing to me. The Buddha is really talking about not just having a really pleasant experience that's free of war and famine and so on, where there's abundance, but he's really talking about a true mental cessation of afflicted states. Um, so if someone asserts a different goal of spiritual practice and says that's the final, truth, and well, of course that's fine, but it's just from a different philosophical system. So are there any questions, barring questions about selflessness, which I'm not going to answer in detail right now, but any questions?
Yeah, for all contaminated things are unsatisfactory.
Mhm.
So you said mind as one of them. So I just want to make sure here. Because you mean a contaminated mind, obviously, right? But not
And yeah,
the mind alone.
the mind as we are experiencing it right now that is arising with affliction. Um,
Yeah. Okay.
if we, the reason that our mind is arising with affliction is because we haven't achieved enlightenment yet. At the moment we achieve enlightenment, then our mind isn't going to arise with affliction.
Gotcha.
But our current mind, unfortunately, is just ordinary mind. So,
Right.
Sierra, did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned contaminated means like ordinary, which um yeah, because like you were saying, contaminated in English means like it's a heavy word, like
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, what they're getting at is, the compared to enlightenment, being subject to the afflictions is painful, right? It's not great. It is compared to what the mind could be experiencing, to what our experience could be like. They do use a lot of words like stained by the afflictions. There are a lot of kind of heavy words like that. But yeah, it's not my favorite. I prefer just thinking of it. Well, we're not enlightened. We're just ordinary. There is past karma that is mixed with affliction, and that is, because that is the cause, then it can't be satisfactory. Only the state of, from the Buddhist perspective, only enlightenment is truly satisfactory. So, all right. So, so this section is kind of like both what is or isn't a Buddhist teaching, and now what is the ethical foundation of being a Buddhist is the second part of this. So, the ethical foundation of being a Buddhist means a person who is abiding by the five lay precepts. So the first is mainly do not kill, and then do not lie, do not steal, do not commit sexual misconduct, and do not take intoxicants. So to kill um, means to not kill. The vow itself or the precept itself, a person when they become Buddhist, they engage in a particular ceremony called going for refuge, and they agree to abide by the five precepts. And the first is do not kill. And it does apply to every sentient being, even things like mosquitoes and ants and worms and so on. So it doesn't mean that, I mean, of course, when we drive a car, when we walk on the grass, there are sentient beings that are harmed, but we're not observing a sentient being and wishing, I want to end the life of this sentient being. That's what we're restraining ourselves from, observing a sentient being really having the genuine desire to end their life and then going about ending their life. Unavoidably, we cause harm by existing, and that's separate. So it means intentionally killing. Lying means to intentionally say something that we know is not the truth in order to be misleading or to manipulate another person in some way. Um, and again, that can just be exaggerating what was, the truth, saying, it wasn't like this, it was like this, when we know it really wasn't. Um, and even, trying to avoid a difficult conversation by, just avoiding what we know to be true. Now, with all of these, we do have to use our wisdom also. We don't have just a slavish kind of relationship to these guidelines because we might save a life, we might save a human life by misleading someone who wishes to cause harm. And in that moment, that might be the best choice. We shouldn't aid someone who wishes to cause harm because we're like, oh, I do know where this person is, so I'm going to tell you so that you can go harm them. We always have to use our wisdom as to the best of our ability in making these choices. Um, so to steal, stealing is a little bit different than how we might ordinarily think of it. So this is, again, this is for a person who chooses to be Buddhist, doesn't apply in any other circumstance. When that person chooses that, they are agreeing to relate to stealing in terms of to not take that which has not been freely given to me. So that means not appropriating something that you find, on the street. We wouldn't necessarily think of that as stealing. If you find a $5 bill in the middle of the night, there's no one anywhere in any direction, you might think, well, sweet, I get to spend $5. That's stealing from the Buddhist perspective because the owner of that $5 bill isn't you, and they didn't hand it to you. They didn't give it to you. Um, so it's a higher bar from this point forward as a mental training. Um, and so then sexual misconduct is has two forms. One is what in English we might call adultery, which means to violate any reasonable expectation of monogamy. Could be your own relationship, doesn't have to be a marriage, just a reasonable expectation of monogamy exists, and you choose to violate that expectation. Could be the other person is in a monogamous relationship, and you know that, and you try to pull them out of that relationship. That's adultery, or just think of it as violating a reasonable expectation of adultery, of monogamy, one where you've actually agreed to be monogamous, and it's a established expectation. And then any kind of harm that you might cause through with your body with regard to, so any kind of unconsensual sexual act is also covered here. And intoxicants refer to recreational substances. If something is prescribed by a doctor, it's not an intoxicant, regardless of what it is. But if a person is just taking something recreationally and their goal is to just kind of have a psychotropic effect just for the goal of fun, for pleasure. And the Buddha's concern here isn't really, he's not against people having fun. The problem is that we lose our mindfulness. The problem is we lose sight of how to treat other people appropriately when our faculties are impaired. So we shouldn't intentionally seek out substances that put us in that position because we may act unethically. We may act in ways because we're just not capable of maintaining our discipline when we have impacted our mind. Now, is a single drink going to lead to that for a person who doesn't have a problem with alcohol, who could stop after a single drink? Well, no, probably not. So people have to decide for themselves, like, is a single drink okay? The real strict way of thinking about this is, I just don't need it. There's just no reason for me to just entertain. That's the strict way. But we have to judge, for ourselves. Am I in danger of, like, why am I just trying to fit in? Like, why am I doing this? Like, those are reasonable questions to ask. Um, do I have a problem with alcohol? That's another reasonable question to ask. Um, but really, the intent of this is to avoid a situation where we're not going to be able to be ethical with others because we're disinhibited and we don't have a disciplined mind. So at the point where a person chooses to be a Buddhist, they are agreeing to not kill, not steal, not lie, not commit sexual misconduct, and to avoid becoming intoxicated at least. Any questions about the five lay precepts?
Yeah, just had a quick question. Yeah, so I know in certain Buddhist philosophies, they talk about eating meat, actually. And they compare it to basically you killing your own mother, you know. The so in terms of this whole not harming animals, right? To be like a vegetarian, this is something that I've tried incorporating in my own practice, to see that okay, live beings are being killed for your nutrition here, so I've questioned myself deeply. And when it came down to it, the longest that I went was about maybe a month, or maybe even less. It's just, I don't know what it is. I just couldn't either figure the diet out, or personal problems of meeting those needs. But now, where does that lie within the precept
Mhm.
of not harming others exactly? And what do I do to sort of alleviate that?
So, in terms of the karma of killing, a person, in order for, in terms of the vows, um, a person, so hunting, for example, certainly would be covered, by the vows, whether it's recreational. If a person is in a position where they might die, and they're trying to just not die, then I would say don't die. I would say like, do what you need to do in order to not like feel bad about it. Don't be happy what's happening, but do what you need to do to maintain your life. Um, but most hunting is recreational, and so even if you eat, like it's still a choice, and so hunting is definitely out for a Buddhist. Fishing, hunting, anything like that. In terms of going to the grocery store, it is true that someone else engaged in the actual act of taking that animal's life. And that person is the only person who technically um, engaged in the karma of killing. Now, by purchasing that piece of meat, you're providing an economic incentive for the whole machinery of killing, not you, all, anyone is, participating in the engine that provides an economic incentive, but still it's a person's choice to decide, I want to be a person who kills animals for I mean, of course, a lot of these workers are exploited, they're undocumented. It's a horrible, you know, the screaming on the killing floor and the blood, and I mean, their lives are really pretty hellish, and they would do anything else if they could. Um, so they're really generally very exploited human beings that are involved in this industry. Um, so it's not like they're not like, oh, I could be a car salesman, but really I want to, slit pigs' throats. That's not what's happening. Um, but I'm just saying that is the person who is engaged in the act of killing, is the person who observes the sentient being and takes the sentient being's life. So so the karma of killing doesn't directly attach to the person purchasing a dead animal. Separately, if a person is interested in reading, there's a chapter in the Lankavatara Sutra called On Eating Meat, where the Buddha does provide a whole host of reasons why practitioners ought to avoid eating meat. Um, and I mean, like you said, because consciousnesses are always transmigrating between different realms of existence. Um, you don't know. Well, you have been that the mind of that pig was your own mother at a certain point in the past. Like that mind was connected to a body that was the body of the person that birthed you. Given beginningless past lives, that's just inevitably true. So unavoidably, it is the mind of a that at some point was in relation to you in that way. That is true. So the Buddha does exhort people to avoid eating meat. That is true. In the Lankavatara Sutra, that is the place where there's the most detailed explanation that I'm aware of is in the chapter called On Eating Meat in the Lankavatara Sutra. So, but it is true that in Tibet in particular, because it's not subtropical like many other Buddhist countries, those teachings were not as widely integrated into the culture as they were in China, Japan, India, the subtropical countries where fruits and vegetables and so on are just dropping from every tree. So culturally, there's, some distinctions that arose in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, um, on the topic. But but yeah, so definitely, but the vow relates the vow itself relates to observing a sentient being that is alive, wishing to take its life, and then engaging in an act that takes its life.
Okay, so I'm still creating, I'm still doing, um it's still negative karma, but I guess at a lesser extent.
It's probably some degree of, I mean, of course, it's also true that sentient beings are harmed. We I think that there's value in doing the best that we can. I think that there's value in um, really thinking about what is the best option, in this situation. It is unavoidably also the case that sentient beings are harmed in the cultivation of plants. Um, Fewer sentient beings are harmed in the cultivation of plants because, of course, the animals that we slaughter, they have to eat plants, right? So you have to cultivate the plants to feed to the animals that you then slaughter. Um, so, I do think that there's value in doing the best that we can. Um, but that we don't have an option. I think that this is something that when we recognize that all of our options cause some harm, that helps us to develop the wish to get out of this process where we have these meat suits that require food, that necessarily harms sentient beings. Um,
Right. Okay. Thank you.
okay, we only have a couple minutes. Let me see if there's something we can. No, not really. We don't have time to do anything other than this, so that's fine. All right. Are there any thoughts or questions about what we've covered so far today?
Will this course get into the wisdom part, or is that more of an intermediate thing?
No, I mean, this is a very broad level overview. So um, but yes, in the fifth class, we'll spend about an hour, looking at the wisdom teachings. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other thoughts or questions? Yes, Mary Jo.
Could we do a dedication?
Of course. Is there anything that you would like particularly like to dedicate for?
No. I guess that our minds maybe my words are not good, but invested in this path of liberation, and that all beings that we have, that we are in touch with, uh, near or far, that they may also benefit.
Well, there's no need for me to say anything. That was beautiful. All right. So we are out of time for today. We've got 3 more classes, and yeah, we'll just carry on. We'll circle back to the Four Noble Truths again at the beginning of next week. All right. Have a
Thank
great
you.
have a great week.